It being Maundy Thursday, I would like to talk about one of the most famous works of art anywhere in the world. That's Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. The Last Supper was created for a convent in Milan, Santa Maria delle Grazie, and it was painted directly onto a wall in what would have been the refectory, so where meals took place. So it's very apt for its surroundings. It depicts the moment that Christ tells his disciples, or says to his disciples, "One of you is going to betray me." Only it's not exactly this moment it depicts. It's probably the second just after Jesus has spoken these words, because he's not speaking, he's looking at the table, it has to be said, rather serenely. All around him, however, is a frenzy of animation and reaction. And one of the lovely things about this work is that Da Vinci has given each disciple his own way of reacting to this news. So, for example, St. Peter has pulled out a knife as though he's ready to defend Jesus from this traitor. St. Thomas is pointing up to the heavens, perhaps asking, well, does God know about this? And of course, his gesture foreshadows the gesture that he will make just several days later when he puts his finger into Christ's wound. At the end of the table, other disciples are gesturing towards Jesus. St. Philip is gesturing himself, as though to say, it's not me, I am not the traitor that you're looking for. All of this activity and this sort of almost chaos and noise is amplified because these 13 figures are in really quite a confined space behind the table. Very often in depictions of the Last Supper, Judas will be on the side of the spectator, on the opposite side of the table to Jesus and the rest of the disciples. That isn't the case here, but Judas is still very easy to identify. So in another part of the narrative of the Last Supper, Jesus introduces the institution of the sacrament of Holy Communion. And you'll notice here that he is gesturing towards bread with his left hand and wine with his right hand. So he is saying, take this bread, this is my body, take this wine, this is my blood, and remember me. But just look at his right hand, it's very widely spread. And so I wonder whether he is actually perhaps reaching for the bowl next to the wine. One of the ways that Jesus knows who will betray him is that this is going to be the person who shares his bowl at the Last Supper. So as Jesus reaches towards the bowl, the disciple on his right also reaches towards the bowl, as he also quite forcibly almost recoils from Jesus. Of course, this is Judas, and in his other hand he's holding a pouch with his 30 pieces of silver. Leonardo da Vinci has also done something very clever with the composition. You'll notice that the disciples are in groups of 3. So this reminds us of the Trinity. Jesus himself is beautifully depicted right in the centre of the composition as this perfect triangular shape, and he's framed by this window which gives him a natural halo. It's the only halo depicted in the work, but still there is absolutely no way that this could be taken for anything other than the Last Supper. Of course, now it's also extremely famous. Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper.
This Holy Thursday draws us into the upper room, and it's a room looking at the painting that's all prepared for a family meal. For Jesus gathers his own family together for the celebration of the Passover in Jerusalem. But maybe that's why this painting sits quite comfortably in a monastic dining room in Milan. Company, holy company, feasting and fasting together. Here is a monastic community, a community of followers at table. But they are looked down upon by those first disciples so used to eating and drinking with Jesus. And maybe that's why this scene looks so formal, because it seems a rather strange format for the friends of Jesus to be gathered for that sharing of the Passover meal. But of course, there is a formality in monastic dining, and maybe that's what Leonardo has to reflect in his commission. What we gaze into is Jesus and his disciples as pilgrims together. They come to remember all that God had done for them, and all that God continues to do for them. They touch in that meal the gift of freedom as they remember God's saving action in the lives of their ancestors. But there's not much remembering going on in Leonardo's scene, is there? It seems a little chaotic. It's anything but harmonious, and there's nothing sentimental about it. Is it I, Lord? Is it him? Does he know what he's talking about? You can see from the gestures that Leonardo has used that the disciples can't quite grasp what Jesus is saying, but that's nothing strange. But the meal is not about them, it's about him, because there's something of a change and a transformation taking place. For this simple Passover commemoration is now going to take on a new shape and a new meaning. This bread and this cup will become the living memory of a body that is broken and a blood that is poured out. This is a new covenant being made, and it's about to be sealed in Jesus' giving of himself. The meal that is shared is a meal, though, that doesn't stand on its own, because we cannot gaze at this scene, nor can we ponder the gospel narrative without looking at what comes next. For the bread, Christ's body, is given for the life of the world on the wood of the cross. The cup of wine, his blood, will be poured out for the forgiveness of our sins. So there is no need now for bitter herbs and salty water, because the bitterness that comes with sin's bite, and that bitterness of death, and the saltiness of those tears of grief that have come because of alienation from God, well, they're to be wiped away. Christ gives himself as the perfect sacrifice that brings salvation, peace, freedom, and life, not simply at the table in the upper room, but on the table, the altar of the cross. But in this meal of remembrance that Jesus has left us, we continue to touch and encounter and experience the immense depths of his love for us. And in his self-giving as nourishment, as food, as refreshment, we grow to become more like him as we immerse ourselves into the mystery of his passion. At the centre of Leonardo's fresco, though, is Christ, calmly presiding, in charge, holding that rather dysfunctional band in some sort of communion, in a holy communion, holding everything together. And Christ is focused, gathering his community around the gift that brings us peace. And just maybe, as he has left us in the Eucharist the memory of his giving, so he also leaves us in the Eucharist the promise of what is to come, a life, a joy, a peace, a holy communion at the table of God's children in heaven.